Let me tell you something strange about people who blame themselves when they can't protect others. We live in a world that celebrates independence, boundaries, and self-care. But there are souls who carry a different weight, one the world rarely acknowledges. Maybe you're one of them, and maybe no one has ever explained to you why your heart works this way, why every failure to shield someone you love feels like a betrayal of your own existence. If you want to understand what you feel without labels, and find words to explain yourself without justifying, subscribe. Here we translate psychology into relief, not diagnosis. This isn't about fixing you or teaching you to care less. It's about seeing clearly what you've always carried in the dark and finally recognizing it not as weakness, but as a form of love so intense it sometimes forgets its own limits. Because here's what nobody tells you. That instinct to protect, that visceral need to stand between the people you love and their pain, it isn't neurosis. It's not codependency or savior complex, though the world will try to label it that way. What if it's actually a quiet form of moral clarity? What if blaming yourself when you can't protect others is simply what happens when your empathy is so developed that you feel responsible not just for your actions, but for the state of the world around the people you love? The culture calls this excessive responsibility. It suggests you need better boundaries, more detachment, healthier emotional distance. But maybe what you have is something rarer. An inability to separate your peace from others' safety, a nervous system so finely tuned to suffering that it registers others' pain as your own failure. Not because you're broken, but because your care is structural. It's not what you do, it's the architecture of how you exist in the world. And that kind of love, the kind that feels like duty, like debt, like eternal vigilance, the world doesn't have gentle words for it yet. We live in a culture that rewards the opposite, where self-preservation is wisdom and detachment is maturity, where protecting your energy means learning to watch others struggle without letting it touch you. But maybe the real violence is being told that caring too much is the problem, that your inability to compartmentalize love from responsibility is something to overcome rather than understand. The dominant narrative says, you can't save everyone, so save yourself. Set boundaries. Don't carry what isn't yours. And rationally, you know this is true. You've read the articles, heard the advice, maybe even given it to others. But when someone you love is hurting and you couldn't stop it, all that wisdom dissolves. What remains is a simple, ancient feeling. I should have done more. I should have seen it coming. I should have been stronger, faster, more present, more capable. This is the clash nobody prepares you for, the war between what you know intellectually and what you feel in your body. Psychologists talk about hyper-responsibility, the cognitive distortion of overestimating your control over outcomes. They explain locus of control, enmeshment, the blurred lines between self and other. And yes, these concepts have value, but they don't capture the texture of it, do they? The way your chest tightens when someone you love faces something you can't fix. The way you replay moments in your mind, searching for the intervention you missed, the words you didn't say, the protection you failed to provide. It's not that you believe you're omnipotent. You know your limitations. But knowing them doesn't stop you from feeling like those limitations are personal failures. This is where psychology meets something deeper, a moral philosophy written into your nervous system. You experience others' suffering not as separate events happening to separate people, but as evidence of your own insufficiency. Their pain becomes your accountability, not because you caused it, but because you existed alongside it and couldn't stop it. And in some profound way, that feels the same as causing it. Psychologists call this an external locus of responsibility, when you feel accountable for outcomes beyond your actual influence. It's the inverse of the self-protective thinking most people have, where bad things are explained away by circumstance or others' choices. You do the opposite. You absorb causation. You become the reason, the missing piece, the failure point. In other words, You've trained yourself to be the variable that could have changed everything, even when you couldn't have. This usually begins early, often in childhood environments where love felt conditional on your usefulness, where being good meant being protective, vigilant, attuned to others' needs before your own. Maybe you learned that your value was measured by your ability to minimize others' pain. Maybe you watched someone you loved suffer and felt the helplessness calcify into a promise, never again, not on my watch. Whatever it costs, I will be the one who stands between them and the world. And that promise became your identity. What develops is a kind of emotional mathematics that doesn't add up but feels absolutely true. If I care enough, I should be able to prevent suffering. If I'm vigilant enough, strong enough, smart enough, I should be able to protect. And when I can't, when life delivers its inevitable cruelties despite my best efforts, then I have failed the primary obligation of love. This is the logic of hyper-responsibility. It makes you the center of every story, not because you're egotistical, but because you've accepted a burden most people instinctively refuse: total emotional liability for others' well-being. The painful irony is that this often comes from genuine goodness. You're not a narcissist who needs to control others' stories. You're someone whose empathy is so acute that you can't distinguish between witnessing pain and causing it. You feel responsible because your care is that complete. But here's what that does over time. It turns love into an impossible standard. It makes connection feel like a test you're always failing. And it robs you of the ability to simply be with someone in their struggle without making it about your inadequacy. The very thing that makes you so devoted, your refusal to accept others' suffering as inevitable, becomes the thing that makes you suffer most. Of course, it doesn't always come from peace. Sometimes this self-blame is a defense mechanism, a way of maintaining the illusion of control in a fundamentally uncontrollable world. If you're to blame, then there was something you could have done differently. And if there was something you could have done, then the universe isn't random and cruel. It's just that you weren't good enough yet. That's almost more comforting than the truth, that terrible things happen to people you love, and your love, no matter how fierce, can't always stop them. Sometimes it's easier to carry guilt than to sit with powerlessness. Guilt at least gives you agency. Even if it's retroactive and imaginary, it lets you believe that next time will be different, that you can learn from this failure, that you can become the person who finally gets it right. Powerlessness offers no such comfort. It just sits there stark and unanswerable. You can love someone completely and still watch them hurt. You can give everything and still not be enough. That truth is so destabilizing that your mind chooses guilt instead, because guilt, at least, suggests the problem is solvable if you just try harder. And sometimes, yes, it's fear. Fear of being seen as careless, of not mattering enough, of love being insufficient. If you don't blame yourself, who will? If you don't carry this weight, does that mean you didn't care? There's a superstitious quality to it, as if your self-blame is the price you pay for the privilege of loving someone, as if suffering alongside them, even in this private and invisible way, is how you prove your devotion. It becomes a form of loyalty, punishing yourself for outcomes you couldn't control, as if that punishment somehow honors the person who suffered. But here's what makes this human rather than pathological. Even when it comes from fear, even when it's a defense, even when it's distorted, it still comes from care. That's the part worth protecting in yourself. Not the self-blame itself, but what it reveals about you. You're someone who takes love seriously, who feels others' pain as morally significant, who can't shrug and say, "Not my problem," when someone you care about is hurting. And that kind of heart, even when it torments you, is rare. The work isn't to stop caring. It's to learn that caring doesn't require you to be omnipotent, that love can be complete even when protection isn't. Blaming yourself when you can't protect others isn't cruelty. It's conscience taken to its most sensitive extreme. It's not about control. It's about being unable to make peace with a world where people you love can be hurt and you can do nothing but witness it. That's not weakness. That's what happens when someone's empathy is so structurally integrated that boundaries feel like betrayal and self-preservation feels like abandonment. Think of it this way. Choosing to carry blame isn't the same as choosing to suffer needlessly. It's your psyche's way of staying connected to someone's pain when you can't fix it. It's a refusal to move on, to accept, to let the wound close before they've healed. You blame yourself because disconnecting from their suffering feels like disconnecting from them. And for you, presence, even painful presence, is how you love. This is emotional congruence at its most intense. You're not performing care. You're structurally unable to compartmentalize it. Most people protect themselves by creating distance between their identity and others' outcomes. You do the opposite. You shorten the distance until there's no separation at all. Their pain is your failure. Their safety is your responsibility. Their peace is your obligation. This isn't martyrdom. It's what happens when your sense of self is deeply, inextricably relational. When I am okay can only be true if they are okay is also true. It's not pathological fusion. It's a different organizing principle entirely, one where love means total accountability, even for things beyond your power. And yes, this will exhaust you. Yes, it will make relationships feel heavier than they do for others. But it will also make you the person people turn to when they need someone who won't minimize their pain or rush them toward healing. You'll be the one who stays, who remembers, who doesn't move on just because the crisis passed. Because for you, their suffering isn't a temporary event. It's something you witnessed, something you couldn't prevent, something you'll carry as evidence of your own limits. That's the gift and the curse of loving this way. You can't protect yourself from caring, so you turn that inability into a form of devotion. And maybe that's not something to fix. Maybe it's just something to finally understand. Let me continue with the final 5 sections. It's not about closing off. It's about learning to distinguish between responsibility and presence. You can be fully with someone in their pain without believing you caused it by failing to prevent it. You can say, I see you're hurting, and I wish I could have stopped this, but my love for you doesn't require me to be powerful enough to control the world. That's not detachment. That's the difference between caring and carrying. One keeps you connected, the other slowly breaks you under weight that was never yours to lift. Here's the language you might need, the words that honor what you feel without collapsing under it. I love you enough that your pain feels like mine. But I'm learning that feeling responsible isn't the same as being responsible. I can be heartbroken that I couldn't protect you and still know I'm not the reason you're suffering. This is self-awareness meeting compassion. It's the recognition that your instinct to blame yourself is real and valid, and also not factually true. Both things can exist. The feeling is legitimate. The conclusion it draws is not. What you're actually doing when you blame yourself is trying to love someone so completely that you erase the randomness of suffering. You're trying to make the world fair by accepting punishment for its cruelties. But fairness doesn't work that way. Pain isn't distributed based on who tried hard enough to prevent it. Sometimes people you love will suffer, and you'll have done everything right, and it still won't be enough. That's not your failure. That's the human condition. And your self-blame, tender as it is, can't actually change that. What it can do is make you suffer alongside them, which feels like solidarity, but is actually just doubling the pain in the world. The practice, then, becomes this. Notice when you're blaming yourself. Don't fight it or judge it, just notice. Say to yourself, I'm doing that thing again where I take responsibility for outcomes I couldn't control because it feels more bearable than accepting my powerlessness. Name it. And then gently ask, what if I stayed present to their pain without making it about my inadequacy? What if I just loved them through this without needing to be the person who could have prevented it? That's not easy. It goes against every instinct you have. But it's the difference between compassionate presence and self-punishing vigilance. One sustains connection, the other exhausts it. There's a concept in psychology called negative responsibility, the idea that you can feel morally culpable not just for harm you cause, but for harm you fail to prevent. Philosophers debate whether this is rational, but for people like you, it's not a debate. It's the water you swim in. You feel the weight of negative responsibility in your body before your mind can even articulate it. Someone hurts, and your first thought isn't, what happened to them, but what didn't I do? This often traces back to environments where you learned that love equals protection, where being cared for meant being shielded, and therefore caring for others must mean shielding them too. Maybe you grew up watching someone struggle, a parent, a sibling, a friend, and felt helpless. That helplessness was unbearable, so you transformed it into a vow. I will never let this happen again. I will become strong enough, aware enough, capable enough that no one I love will suffer like this. And that vow became your operating system. The problem is that the vow was impossible from the start. You were trying to protect people from life itself, from loss and disappointment and the inevitable frictions of existence. But you didn't know that yet. You just knew that suffering felt unacceptable and that you somehow needed to be the one to stop it. So you built your identity around vigilance. You learned to scan for danger, to anticipate needs, to position yourself between the people you love and anything that might hurt them. And when something got through anyway, because something always does, you didn't blame the world. You blamed the vigilance. You blamed yourself for not being vigilant enough. What develops over time is a kind of moral hypervigilance, where you're constantly monitoring not just your actions, but your potential actions, the ones you didn't take, the interventions you missed. Every moment becomes retroactively filled with opportunities you failed to seize. You replay conversations, searching for the thing you should have said. You review timelines, looking for the warning sign you should have noticed. And because hindsight makes everything feel obvious, you convince yourself that you should have known, should have done more, should have been better. This is the exhausting mathematics of self-blame. It takes the randomness of life and turns it into a series of tests you failed. And the cruelest part is that you're both the student and the grader, failing yourself over and over for problems that had no solution. Not every failure to protect is a failure of love. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is accept that you cannot shield someone from everything painful, and that your inability to do so doesn't diminish your devotion. Sometimes presence matters more than prevention. Sometimes being with someone in their struggle, without fixing it, without taking responsibility for it, without making it about your inadequacy, is the deepest form of care. But that requires a radical shift in how you understand love. You've been operating under the belief that love means elimination of suffering, that if you truly care, you'll find a way to prevent pain. But what if love actually means staying close to someone even when you can't prevent their pain? What if it means bearing witness without needing to be the hero, the protector, the one who makes everything okay? That kind of love is quieter, less dramatic, and infinitely harder for someone like you. Because it requires you to tolerate your own powerlessness, to sit with the discomfort of caring deeply while being unable to control outcomes. Think about the people you love. What do they actually need from you when they're hurting? Do they need you to have prevented it, to go back in time and make different choices so their suffering never happened? Or do they need you to be present now, to not disappear into your own guilt and self-recrimination, to stay connected to them rather than getting lost in the story of your own failure? Most of the time, they don't need a savior. They need a companion. Someone who can hold space for their pain without making it about whether they did enough. But you've trained yourself to measure love by its protective capacity, so simply being there feels insufficient. It feels passive, weak, like you're not trying hard enough. This is where you have to challenge your own definition of strength. Strength isn't always intervention. Sometimes it's the ability to remain present with suffering you can't fix, to love someone through something you can't change, to let your care be enough, even when it can't prevent or repair. That's not resignation. It's a more mature form of love. One that doesn't require you to be omnipotent to be valuable. One that trusts that your presence matters even when your protection fails. Here's what nobody tells you about people who blame themselves for failing to protect others. You're often trying to solve an old equation with new people. The person you couldn't protect back then, maybe it was yourself, maybe it was someone you loved who suffered while you were too young or too powerless to intervene. That person still lives in you. And every time someone you care about now experiences pain you can't prevent, you're not just feeling current helplessness. You're feeling all the accumulated helplessness of every time you weren't enough, couldn't do enough, didn't matter enough to change the outcome. This is why your reaction can feel disproportionate to the situation, why a friend's bad day can send you into spirals of self-blame, why your partner's disappointment can feel like evidence of your fundamental inadequacy. You're not just responding to what's happening now. You're responding to the archive of all the times you stood at the edge of someone's suffering and couldn't reach them. And each new instance reactivates that archive, makes you feel like you're failing the same test over and over, like you'll never learn to be enough. The healing, if there is such a thing, comes from separating the past from the present, from recognizing that your current self-blame might be echoing an old wound that has nothing to do with the current situation. You couldn't protect that person back then, and maybe that was genuinely tragic, genuinely unfair, genuinely something worth grieving. But that doesn't mean every subsequent inability to prevent someone's pain is the same failure. You're not still that powerless child or that overwhelmed teenager or that person who loved someone they couldn't save. You're here now, doing your best with the power you actually have, which is limited and human and enough. What you're carrying isn't just guilt. It's unprocessed grief about the limits of love, about the ways care isn't always sufficient to prevent harm, about the fundamental unfairness of a world where good people suffer despite being loved by people like you who would do anything to stop it. And until you grieve that, until you let yourself feel the sadness of your own powerlessness without turning it into self-blame, you'll keep trying to retroactively fix it by being perfect now. But perfection won't heal that wound. Only acknowledgement will, only the gentle, painful recognition that you've always done your best, and sometimes your best couldn't change what needed changing, and that's heartbreaking and true and not your fault. Not every absence is emptiness. Sometimes it's where the soul learns what love can and cannot do. And maybe blaming yourself when you can't protect others isn't moral failure or emotional dysfunction. Maybe it's what happens when someone's heart is too honest to pretend that others' suffering doesn't matter. Maybe it's the price of caring in a world that will always contain more pain than any one person can prevent. And maybe the way back to yourself isn't learning to care less, but learning that your care doesn't require omnipotence to be real. What part of you has the world never understood? The way your love feels like liability, the way your devotion translates into impossible responsibility, the way you can't celebrate your own peace while someone you love is struggling. What if that's not something to fix, but something to finally hold gently? What if your self-blame is just your conscience speaking a language it learned too young, one where love meant total protection or it meant nothing at all? You can thank that part of yourself for trying so hard, for caring so much, for never giving up on the idea that your love should be powerful enough to prevent suffering. And then you can tell it, quietly, I don't have to be that powerful for my love to matter. The people you love don't need you to be invincible, they need you to be present. They need you to stop disappearing into guilt when you can't fix everything, to stop making their pain about your adequacy, to just be there without the constant internal interrogation of whether you're doing enough. Your self-blame, tender as it is, isn't actually serving them. It's just making you less available, less able to offer the uncomplicated presence that matters most. And maybe that's the real work. Not learning to protect everyone, but learning to be with them without needing to be their shield. Learning that love can be complete even when protection isn't. If this gave you words to understand what you've always felt, if it helped you see that your impossible sense of responsibility isn't weakness, but a kind of devotion the world doesn't have gentle names for yet, subscribe. Here we speak about what the world never named, but you've always known. Here we find language for the hearts that blame themselves for every hurt they couldn't prevent, and remind them that their care, even when it can't save everyone, is still the most beautiful thing about them. You're not failing at love. You're just learning what it actually means. Not the power to prevent all suffering, but the courage to stay close to it anyway.